Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission, as always, is pretty straightforward. We take that pile of complex sources you've got, pull out the crucial bits, and basically give you the shortcut to really understanding it. Today, we're zeroing in on the big players governing global aviation safety. EASA, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, and the FAA, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. We've looked at what they choose to put front and center, their missions, their structures, their big priorities, to figure out their core identities, and specifically how they handle the really fundamental job of certifying aircraft.
That's right. And the key thing here, I think, is that while both are obviously about safety, the way they talk about themselves, their stated goals, their public focus areas, it all points to some pretty different philosophies underneath, especially when it comes to deciding if a plane is actually safe to fly. We're looking at the documents, the organizational setups that basically define how an aircraft gets the green light in Europe versus the U.S.
Okay, let's get into it then, starting with those mission statements. Because this seems to be where the differences really kick off immediately. And when we talk about, say, getting a type certificate for a new plane, that basic proof the design meets the safety rules.
Right.
Well, that's job number one for both, isn't it?
It absolutely is. So look at EASA first. Their mission statement is, well, incredibly focused. Your safety is our mission.
Simple.
Direct.
Exactly. It's clean, seems purely focused on protecting people, protecting the system. Just safety.
Okay, now let's compare that to the FAA. Their stated goal is providing the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world.
And that little phrase, most efficient, well, it changes everything, doesn't it?
It really does.
It tells you straight away the FAA is operating under this significant dual mandate. They're not just focused on certification, on preventing accidents, which is obviously huge. They're also explicitly tasked with keeping things moving. Operational flow, minimizing delays, keeping that massive U.S. air travel engine running smoothly. But doesn't that immediately create some, tension?
Yeah.
How do you genuinely prioritize being the safest if this huge commercial pressure demands you also be the most efficient? Is there sort of a built-in compromise right from the mission statement, maybe just because of the sheer volume they handle?
I think the sources definitely suggest that tension is just part of their daily reality.
Yeah.
When you throw efficiency into the mix, you immediately bring in logistics, economic factors, things EASA's safety-only focus perhaps tries to insulate itself from a bit more. And you see this difference play out right away in how they're structured and how they communicate.
Yeah, their structures are quite distinct. EASA takes this two-pronged approach, clearly splitting its audience. You've got EASA Light that's aimed at passengers, the general public, and the EU.
Right, the citizen focus.
And then EASA Pro, which is specifically for the aviation authorities, the industry folks, the media.
And that pro-light split, I think it's quite revealing. It shows EASA actively trying to manage two very different kinds of conversations at the same time. EASA Light tackles things like passenger safety, well-being, more accessible stuff.
While EASA Pro is where the heavy-duty technical things live, like those type certificates we mentioned, the really complex regulations. That's for the professionals.
Oh, precisely.
Now, the FAA, it's presented very differently, strictly as part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. The sources even flag it as an official government organization, emphasizing the whole secure.gov context. Its position is this single unified government body.
Yeah, that's a sharp contrast. EASA is kind of talking to consumers and industry separately, tailoring the message. The FAA presents itself more as, well, the big government agency that runs the whole show. One entity, one mandate, albeit a complicated one.
So, if the missions set the stage, then the topics they choose to highlight. That tells us where they're placing their bets for the future, maybe. Let's look at EASA's pro side specifically. Beyond the standard operational stuff, we see a really strong emphasis on sustainability and urban air mobility, or UAM.
Right, and those two actually pop up on both the light and pro lists. That suggests EASA is really pushing hard on the future rulemaking for things like, electric air taxis, environmental standards.
Stuff that isn't quite mainstream yet.
Exactly. And since EASA is the one issuing the type certificates, they're essentially designing the safety rulebook for that next generation of aircraft now.
Okay, now let's pivot to the FAA's major categories. They cover the expected ground: air traffic, airports, pilots, regulations. But they also prominently list space and data and research.
That space piece is a huge difference in scope, isn't it? It really highlights the FAA's unique national role. Their responsibility literally extends beyond Earth's atmosphere. They even list a specific number, 927 licensed commercial space launches. That shows a safety oversight that covers things leaving the planet entirely. That kind of scope just isn't visible in EASA's main public-facing links right now.
That's an incredible breadth of responsibility. But there is one area where they clearly overlap, a shared priority that really stands out.
Drones.
Yeah, drones. Both agencies listed as a major focus. And the FAA gives us some hard numbers on scale. 822,039 drones registered. And get this, 460,375 certificated remote pilots.
That sheer density of traffic, even in the lower airspace, it forces both EASA and the FAA to be deeply involved in regulating and certifying the operators, the equipment. It's an area where their safety mandates absolutely have to converge.
Let's circle back to that FAA mission of efficiency, though, and link it to the operational scale they talk about. Because the EASA material doesn't really give us similar public-facing numbers. The FAA handles, on average, 44,360 daily flights.
Just pause on that number. 44,360. I mean, try to picture that volume. That's an aircraft taking off or landing almost every 2 seconds, somewhere in the U.S., around the clock.
Staggering.
It really is. And that kind of constant pressure, well, it makes that efficiency mandate sound almost terrifyingly essential. Because if efficiency breaks down at that scale, the whole system, maybe even the economy, could just grind to a halt.
And the source material points to the massive investment needed just to keep that system flowing. It mentions $25 billion invested in aviation through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This isn't just about safety upgrades and isolation. It sounds like an investment in maintaining the flow, ensuring those 44,000 flights can actually happen.
It's a logistics investment, absolutely tied to that efficiency goal. And you see that focus on active, real-time logistics plastered all over the FAA's public information. We're not just seeing strategic plans, we're seeing the messy reality of day-to-day operations. The FAA's public face is inherently about managing logistics and dealing with disruption.
Exactly. Like right there on their site, you see these real-time updates. Ground delays at SFO San Francisco because of low ceilings. Delays at Newark and Charlotte just listed as other. They're tracking the minute-by-minute friction in the system.
And you also see them using their regulatory power very directly, very immediately to manage that capacity. The sources mention specific ground stoppages, airport closures, notices like Las Vegas requiring 24-hour prior permission required, PPR, for certain visiting aircraft. That's active traffic management reacting to conditions on the ground right now.
And speaking of immediate action, there's breaking news mention. The U.S. Transportation Secretary and the FAA Administrator actually outlining proactive steps, including, remarkably, a 10% reduction in flights at 40 key high-traffic airports.
Wow, a 10% cut.
Yeah, which is a direct operational decision where arguably safety and maybe system sustainability are being chosen over pure efficiency. That seems like a fascinating moment where the dual mandate hits a hard limit.
And managing this scale requires some serious regulatory tools. The FAA lists specific things like airworthiness directives or ADs. Those are mandatory fixes for aircraft.
Right, stuff owners have to do.
And temporary flight restrictions, TFRs, which are basically no-fly zones popped up temporarily for safety or security reasons.
And then there's this layer of real-world context dropped in. The source notes that parts of the Department of Transportation, which is the FAA's parent organization, are actually in shutdown or furlough because of funding issues.
That's critical context.
It really is. The agency juggling 44,000 flights daily is doing it while facing these, direct outside pressures on its own ability to function fully.
Which just raises that fundamental question about vulnerability, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How can you guarantee the safest, most efficient system when your own operational capacity can be impacted by politics and funding battles?
Okay, let's shift slightly to how they document their rules, because this highlights another interesting difference, maybe touching on that certification philosophy again. ES Pro lists regulations, and then this acronym, AMC and GM.
Right, AMC and GM. That stands for Acceptable Means of Compliance and Guidance Material. And understanding that is, I think, pretty key to grasping EASA's approach.
How so?
Well, it often means EASA doesn't just state the rule. They also provide a kind of blueprint, an acceptable way for the industry to meet that rule. It suggests a more structured, maybe even prescriptive, path for things like type certification and ongoing operations.
So EASA sets the safety goal and kind of offers a suggested roadmap to get there.
Often, yes. which can streamline things for manufacturers and operators, maybe reduce some ambiguity in the certification process. The FAA, on the other hand, with its huge dynamic operational role, it uses a much broader toolkit of documents, advisory circulars, FAA regulations, orders, notices, handbooks, manuals.
It sounds like a bigger library.
It's a vast library. It feels less like providing one single blueprint and more like issuing this extensive, constantly evolving body of guidance and requirements to cover that incredibly diverse and massive aerospace system.
But interestingly, separate from all that dense regulatory stuff, the FAA site has that very practical, almost customer service section. How do I?
Yeah, that how do I list is quite revealing about the FAA's role as, a public-facing government service. It gives people direct answers for everyday things. How do I report a laser strike, register my aircraft, travel with batteries, report a noise issue?
It's very ground level stuff.
It is, and it contrasts quite a bit with EASA's public outreach, which uses that pro-light structure to channel information differently to the public versus the industry pros. The FAA seems to be handling more direct citizen interaction right on its main platform.
And lastly, connecting back to safety events, something you mentioned earlier, the FAA's feature topics often link directly to recent incidents. We get that aha moment. The sources mention FAQs about a specific mid-air collision near Reagan National Airport back in January, and details on the tough standards for air traffic controller qualifications.
Right. So their public communication is often very reactive to immediate operational safety concerns and incidents.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. Synthesizing the main differences in their identities based on what they show us. EASA seems to highlight a very structured regulatory process, clearly defined by things like type certificates, and it's heavily focused on building the rules for the future of European aviation UAM sustainability.
Definitely a future-oriented rule definition focus, whereas the FAA emphasizes its sheer operational scale, that constant balancing act between safety and efficiency, and its incredibly broad scope covering drones, managing today's gridlock, all the way up to commercial space travel.
Yeah, its public identity feels deeply rooted in managing this immense, immediate, complex logistical reality.
So if you connect it all up, what the source material seems to show is EASA really concentrating on defining and implementing the certification rules for the next chapter in aviation.
Setting the stage for what's next.
Exactly. While the FAA is doing that too, but simultaneously, it's wrestling with the enormous, chaotic day-to-day job of keeping the current massive American airspace system running, often, as we saw, under some pretty significant external pressures.
Which brings us nicely to our final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Considering the FAA has to manage nearly 45,000 flights every single day, while also dealing with things like potential funding gaps and even having to proactively cut flights at major hubs by 10%, what kind of inherent compromises does that dual mission being the safest and the most efficient inevitably demand, especially when it comes to the fundamental decisions around certifying aircraft? What does efficiency ultimately cost safety when resources aren't infinite? Something to think about. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.